Flipping the Table.
Hello, this is Michael Reed Dimmock, and you're listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast featuring honest conversations and brief commentaries about the future of food and farming. I'm inspired by the thousands of farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers across this nation who are meeting the many challenges related to nutrition, poverty, pollution, and climate. This podcast highlights the people and actions making our planet and communities healthier and more resilient. I hope to inspire listeners to use their food purchases and their votes, our democracy, to flip the table in support of a new and better food system for us all, to be part of the delicious revolution now underway.
California is the most productive agricultural state in the nation, measured by both the amount of money it produces and its diversity of products. Farmers and ranchers generate about $50 billion annually and harvest 400 different products. Of course, the combination of nature and human creativity are the source of this abundance. California is one of only a few places on the planet with a Mediterranean climate coupled with numerous inland and coastal mountain ranges that deliver, through past volcanic eruptions and ongoing erosion of rock outcroppings, rich deposits of minerals to support fertile alluvial soils. These mountain ranges also provide abundant rain and snow, particularly the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Range. Those gifts of nature, coupled with the desire for wealth, the spirit of innovation, commitment to education and research, and a positivity about a bright future, have made the state an agricultural wonder unparalleled in human history. Of course, there are numerous challenges to this long success, some of which my guests and I will explore. Karen Ross, as California's Secretary of Food and Agriculture, runs the government department known as CDFA. She is tasked with ensuring the continued success of our agricultural system. It is a challenging role in a state that, like the nation, faces a deep political divide between urban and rural and coast and inland. Secretary Ross has been in the role for two progressive Democratic governors. As the CDFA website states, I quote, "In reappointing Secretary Ross, Governor Newsom cited her unmatched leadership experience in agricultural issues nationally, internationally, and here in California, including environmental stewardship, climate change adaptation, and trade," end quote. You will hear more of her history in our conversation, but before it begins, I want to point out why I find her a model leader. I first met Secretary Ross in 2000 when I entered Class 31 of the Agricultural Leadership Program, which is committed to training men and women in agricultural careers to study leadership. The 2-year curriculum included critical thinking, emotional competency, communications, and the deep experiential study of many important issues from agricultural labor to xenophobia, the death penalty to urban poverty. Secretary Ross was on the board of that organization, and I met her at many events and was struck by her embodiment of what we studied, including a principled framing of issues to be explored or addressed by the organization itself. Later, I watched her rally the wine industry, which she led to embrace the challenge of sustainability. Then, along with many others, I collaborated with her to create the California Ag Vision, which she helped to lead as a member of the State Board of Food and Agriculture. Completed in 2010, that document was groundbreaking for a Department of Agriculture anywhere in the world. It's a strategic roadmap outlining ecological, social, labor, and market issues that must be addressed by 2030 to maintain the state's abundance in a century that will be racked by existential challenges. It's been a roadmap for the department ever since. Most importantly, Secretary Ross embraced the fact that unlike in the 100 years preceding, the agricultural sector would need to link to and collaborate with the urban population and the consumer base upon which agriculture actually depends for markets and good policy, particularly public investments. No longer could the department and farm communities pursue policies and practices that they alone felt benefited them. She recognized that the power to shape the future of agriculture depends on a majority of Californians falling in love with the state's farmers and ranchers. As a result, she has sought to mitigate the polarization among those with widely divergent political views and to cultivate a love for California's farmers and ranchers. I think you will see evidence of that in this conversation with Secretary Karen Ross. Secretary Ross, thank you very much for hosting us in your offices here today in the capital of California, Sacramento. Really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. But I would love to start with you just describing for folks your journey to the role for now 9 years, almost 10 years, almost 11 years, Secretary of Food and Agriculture for the state of California.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for having me on this. And of course, you are going to call me Karen. No more of this Secretary Ross stuff, okay?
Okay.
So I'll try to condense this because I'm old and it's been a long journey. And by the way, happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you.
I actually, I grew up on a farm in western Nebraska, very isolated, very sparsely populated part of the panhandle of Nebraska. My husband and I own a big part of that farm now, and my younger brother farms that for us. And as I grew up, I was in 4-H. And I was pretty sure that I didn't want to stay in Banner County. I didn't want to marry a farmer, and I didn't want to be in agriculture. And my dad has always enjoyed it. Before he passed, that every job I ever had was related to ag. And I just happened to be working in an agribusiness company in the northeastern part of the state. And my boss was a Harvard-trained lawyer and had lots of friends in Omaha, and introduced me to politics, and every job I've ever had since then has been connected to working for a United States senator, becoming an advocate, doing a Senate campaign. I was a manager of a Senate campaign, U.S. Senate campaign, and actually finally got to do a presidential campaign. And then my husband said, we're moving to California right after I graduated from the Nebraska Ag Leadership Program. I'm like, honest, I'm going to make a fool of myself. I was like, do they have agriculture in California? Which I share with people because the perception outside of California is we're beaches and movies and high tech. And it's really important for people to understand why policy happens the way it does in Washington, D.C. is how few people are really grounded in what our agriculture is about, our specialty crops and irrigated agriculture in West Coast.
And we are the largest agricultural state in the union.
Number one, have been since USDA has been keeping those records.
Right, and by a large amount, right?
Yeah, $50 billion. So right. the amount, the next two states would make that up. We have counties that have bigger agricultural economies than some states.
Right. It's a remarkable thing.
Bountiful thing.
Yeah, and it's because our crops are valuable crops, right?
Exactly. High value. Yes.
Right.
And nutritious.
Right. And we should say that you worked in the Obama administration.
I did.
As the chief of staff for the secretary of USDA.
I was very fortunate. Secretary Vilsack was a wonderful leader for me to work with and learn from. And I can't imagine a better job training than to be at USDA with the size and the diversity of the portfolio of USDA, and then to have this tremendous opportunity when Jerry Brown asked me to be his Secretary of Agriculture, and even more amazing for this farm girl from Nebraska, this opportunity to work for Governor Newsom. I am so lucky to do what I do, to love what I do, and to work for the people that I do.
Yeah, well, it's been a really good run, I would have to say, having been here and watching what's gone on in policy for decades, really. And I wanted to start with a very broad question. And some, it might appear a little bit of softball, but there's a reason why I want to start this way. And the question is, are you satisfied with the state of California regarding its food, agriculture, and rural policy?
Well, that's pretty broad. We should never be satisfied with status quo, I don't think. I think we all yearn to keep improving and to keep growing and to keep doing better. I think that's just in our DNA, especially as Californians. So, of course, in a state that's the number one agricultural state, in a state that has 40 million consumers who are also voters and our neighbors, in a state that is now down to 70,000 farms, that makes up such a small part of this population, it's hard to break through some of the other big issues to make sure people understand their daily connection to what is grown in our fields and in our orchards and in our pastures and how it travels to get to them, and to understand how to make sure that every Californian has access to the really bountiful, nutritious abundance that we have to offer. So yes, we can always do better. And I think the exciting thing that I've seen in my 9 years, going on 10 years now, are these new coalitions of people, whether it's farmers and environmentalists, farmers and food justice people really recognizing this system as a foundation of the lifestyle that we enjoy in California, and how do we make sure that every Californian has access to that.
Well, good. Then I think this provides a good opportunity for us to kind of dig into some of those places where you think we can go further. And the first one I want to talk about is the idea of rural broadband. And I know the USDA is focused on it. A lot of politicians are talking about it, a lot of policymakers. Certainly the high-tech industry is interested in it. But the real issue in my mind, and I'm curious what you think, is how do we get rural broadband not just to the rural household, but out into the fields so that we can utilize technologies to really allow our farmers to better understand what's going on with nature?
Yeah. So hot topic. Our State Board of Food and Agriculture has had several sessions on this. Joyce Sterling is leading the efforts on behalf of the State Board. Our State Board chairman never misses an opportunity when he's with the governor or any other elected official to talk about his farm in the middle of Fresno County and the cost and the poor quality and the low speeds of what he has. So imagine that's just for farming, let alone for telemedicine, let alone for education of our rural populations that already have a number of disadvantages. So the issue of rural broadband impacts so many people, which I think the rest of the country thinks of California as being the most connected, and many people in California probably don't realize the disadvantages that rural communities are at right now. It's interesting, and maybe that was for your birthday, that just this morning, the FCC announced a $20.4 billion fund for rural broadband.
Wow.
How does California, with the infrastructure that we have, access those dollars, let alone USDA recently announced a second round of funding for Reconnect. How do we make sure that California priorities get factored into that and try to get some of the money they've been announcing for that? Here in the state, we have the California Emergency Technology Fund, which is actually funded by settlements when there are big mergers. Right now, the PUC has ordered that the last two big telecommunications mergers will provide $60 million for broadband. But there's a lot of complexities because of the geography. It's really tough topography. Some of the predominant players that hold on to territory but yet don't do that intermediate and last mile connection. It's very similar to what I grew up with rural electric infrastructure, and who's going to be willing to go in and make that's expensive infrastructure to lay down, but it's literally transformed rural America. We need to do the same.
Is there
thing
any
with
possibility
broadband.
of doing something like they did in the South with rural electrification, where you would create some sort of state, and rather than just using the private sector, a state body that would do that piece?
Yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about the best way of accomplishing this, because the governor announced at the economic summit this year, broadband for all, which we will be in 2020. There'll be a convening led by the state with all of the right players to really take a look at broadband has to be as an important part of our infrastructure as roads and transportation.
It's true.
So I think 2020 will have a lot of statewide discussion on that. Everybody knows what the needs are. It's coming up with the funding and a plan to help deploy it.
Okay. Well, this is something we're very interested in, and just to see some movement in this direction would be quite helpful. It would give people hope and keep up the momentum.
Yes, absolutely.
So I I want to turn to something else, and I think I think this will be close to your heart because I really, besides the Ag Leadership Program, the way that I really watched you through the years was your work with the wine growers in California, way back, moving them to really begin thinking about sustainability and working towards not just thinking about it, but actually acting on it and developing systems to promote it and allow it. So I'm really interested in you describing if you think there can be an expansion of the incentive programs for farmers in the state to adopt really robust stewardship practices, and this relates not just to healthy soil, but to habitat restoration and other activities that allow farmers to be in better relationship to nature, and enhance farm and ranch resilience given the climate circumstances we're moving into in this century.
Yes. So our climate smart ag programs have been fairly widely embraced, and that's been an exciting development for us to be able to provide cost share incentive grants for. The first one was actually our on-farm water use efficiency program, the SWEEP program, still our most oversubscribed program. We actually introduced that during the drought, but it was funded with greenhouse gas emission funds. That's the reduction fund that is funded through cap and trade. So over the last 9 years, over $600 million from cap and trade funds have been invested in the sustainability of agriculture for water use efficiency, energy use reduction, healthy soils, dairy digesters for renewable energy production and alternative manure management program. And then we have the Sustainable Ag Land Conservation Program. There's still a program over at ARB for replacement of diesel engines with cleaner burning engines, and a food processor sustainability program to really help upgrade their energy efficiency. So we've recognized the opportunities to co-invest with agriculture as we all move towards this low carbon economy that we're building in California, and that ag is an important part of it. We're getting even more recognition here and around the world for the ability to sequester carbon as we all move to zero emission scenarios for our future. We have to have this ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the ground. And so farming and ranching will be an important part of that. We saw in the bond discussions that ended in September with the end of the legislature, but we know they'll start on that immediately this year. We saw a whole introduction of $100 million by several people that was proposed for environmental farming so that we can get even into more conservation types of programs for habitat and pollinators and things like that.
Well, the reason I ask is because I know that CalCan, for instance, and others have been talking about, it was great that we went from 15 million to 28 million with healthy soils this last year for the budget. But the question is, can we get to 100 million or 50 million? Because that's really what it's going to take, because this is a big state. There's a lot of land out there.
There's a big state, and there's a couple things I want to say about that. Is that, yes, we want to scale up, but also last year's funding was made available not only because of the governor's commitment of $18 million from the greenhouse gas reduction fund, but also from a bond. First time that there was a direct ag connection in a bond, and the SWEEP program and healthy soils were both included in that bond. So I think that's a part of our future. Bonds obviously run out of funding, so there's not continuous funding. I would also point out that what we're funding, with the acreage we have in the state, we're never going to have enough public dollars to fund every acreage coming into that. But what we're funding are those early adopters and scaling it up through our demonstration projects for farmers who may not want to do the paperwork to get a grant. What we want is for the practices to be widely applied on all the acres, whether there's public dollars helping to fund it or not. What the Farm Bill has done each year in plussing up our conservation programs is absolutely critical.
So you do think then that there will be enhanced opportunities for funding from the future bonds? Because I know there's I read an article this morning early about this kind of struggle over the bond, what's going to be included, because people are starting to worry about how much debt.
Yeah, of course. And so that's always going to be a constraint, but that's also why I think a big piece of this is here in California with the standards that we grow to and being being able to add on to this what we're doing that's climate smart agriculture that's helping with sequestration. This is a very important conversation that's happening in the marketplace. When you look at nationally what's happening with the Soil Health Partnership and the Roundtable and what buyers of our products are asking us to do, there's a real opportunity for additional funding streams that are not just public dollars that we depend on a bond or what the future is of greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Right,
yeah.
which that fund, the greenhouse gas, is now going to be
over time
is not going to be just committed to
exactly.
It's going to be committed to other things.
Yeah,
General
so
fund.
It's very important that this conversation is happening nationally, so that national and international buyers understand that this is a part of what.
So you think that the marketplace might actually throw some dollars in eventually?
I think it should, and I, as you know, I feel very strongly.
Right.
This is what California Grown stands for.
Right.
We should be the preferred provider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, good. So I want to move on to something a little more thorny, which is
like broadband.
No. I'm talking about taxing sugary beverages. You know that I've been working with a lot of the people on this for a long time, and I know taxes are always an unpopular thing politically. Mm-hmm. But do you believe, and so the question really is, do you believe that sugary beverage tax is an appropriate vehicle for creating a long-term funding stream for a number of things that I know you do care about: nutrition incentives, community food projects, improved school food, school gardens, ag literacy, and nutrition education? I mean, our problem is that we can't fund those things very well in this state. So the question is, how do we get to that? And is a sugary beverage tax an appropriate vehicle?
I'm going to be completely neutral on that, since I don't have the expertise, but I would throw the question back to you: is what kind of data are we getting back from New York or from the cities in this state that have put in place a sugar beverage type of tax? Are we getting the results that people should expect from doing that? Are we seeing changes in consumption? Are we seeing changes in obesity rates? Are we seeing changes in diabetes rates? Because that should be first and foremost if we're trying to change habits.
Berkeley, they have shown reduction of 9 to 10% in sugary beverage consumption, no loss of retail sales to retailers because people are buying more water and other drinks and alternatives, so it's not hurting the business world. And finally, it's generating a tremendous amount of funding for school gardens and community-based activities that improve public health. So we know from that. Now, obesity rates and diabetes rates, that's long term. You're not going to see that in 5 years.
Yeah.
But but they are tracking it, and we will know with time. But it's a very small footprint too, one town. So the question is, as I'm going to throw this back, because you said California sets a standard. We are on the cutting edge. And I've even brought this up to the governor in certain instances. And you know, I understand how policymakers have to be careful around this, but I'm really asking is it an appropriate idea to find a source of funding for these activities that's long-term? Because these activities do not get funded hardly at all, right? I mean, the ones that I was mentioning.
That clearly is the challenge of the day. So I think that a discussion of all options on the table is kind of where we started on the drinking water, is put all options on how do we get safe, affordable drinking water to every Californian, and we put a lot of options on the table. And as you know, I was part of advocating that we needed to consider a tax on drinking water, or a fee, or whatever you want to call it. It was very modest, and of course, you saw the strong resistance to that.
Right.
So there's only going to be two ways of getting it. One is going through the legislative body for that kind of public transparency discussion, argument, if you will, of really understanding what these options are and who pays for them and what the benefits of that would be, and then having the political courage for 2/3 votes.
Right.
And there's not been a lot of appetite for that.
Right.
So is the timing right for that? And the other one is the initiative process.
Right.
I prefer to see things debated publicly. You have an opportunity to potentially correct any flaws in the writing of an initiative. So I would prefer that way. And I think that
you prefer an initiative.
No.
You prefer the
no.
legislature, yeah,
No,
the
much
debate.
more prefer.
Yeah, I agree.
think that's the way we should do these laws. But I also understand the frustration when it gets punted year after year of people not having the patience for that.
Right. I wanted to take a short break and give a shout out to one of my favorite podcasts, Farm to Table Talk, hosted by Roger Wasson. I've really enjoyed two of his latest episodes from January 2020. They're with the farmer, the livestock manager, and the chef from Turner Farms, which is just outside the city of Cincinnati in the Midwest. It's a fabulous set of discussions about this really innovative farm that has brought the public onto the farm for education, but also for incredible products and for delicious meals. So check it out. I think you'll really enjoy them. I'm really interested. As you know, I live in Sonoma County, and we recently had announcement of our largest meat processor basically shutting their doors to sources of meat, ranches and farmers in the region who are not part of their brand. So it's creating a tremendous problem. You know about this happening all over the state. It's very difficult to process animals. But there are a lot of other things that small farmers need. And so do you think this idea of a California-based New Green Deal that Rob Bonta is speaking about and other legislators, the idea of some sort of a new Green Deal, do you see that as incorporating aid for small farmers as a potential pathway for some kind of investment in small farms?
So I think it'll be a fascinating conversation. Obviously, what happened out of Washington, D.C. last year has informed a lot of what's happening, what we're seeing right now in the presidential debates on the Democratic side. So clearly, our economy has shifted dramatically, and it will continue to transform. And I think that we need to have a public engagement of what does our future economy look like, and are we aligning the investments for going around the curve in this new economy as opposed to this is where we've always parked our money for investments. Is that really what the future looks like? So I think there's going to be a tremendous opportunity here in California to have a similar dialogue. And my hope is that rural California and agriculture are not just considered as throwaways
Left out.
and left out.
Right.
And that agriculture, we still get tagged with a legacy industry. Well, I think feeding people is not legacy. I think it's like feeding people and feeding people better is how we create the human potential to do all that it was intended to do. And we equip them with that. So I would hope that we have a fully informed and fully rounded conversation about what would that new Green Deal look like, and why wouldn't agriculture and rural communities be an equally important part of that?
It'll be interesting to see. I know the governor, and I'm sure you're very pleased with this. His first move in his first week was to take his whole cabinet down to the Central Valley to talk about water and to talk about rural communities and rural economies.
Yes.
I thought that was really smart. And then him participating in the $1.3 billion water deal to clean up water. He went to those signing ceremony, went down to the valley and talked about it. And you went down.
Governor Newsom has been to the Central Valley frequently.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I was so excited to have this opportunity to continue is because from day one and before that, he has been very committed to a California for all and reconnecting rural urban California. And I think his policies and his investment of time have proven that he's very serious about this. And we all get to play a part in that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons I'm massively enthusiastic about his administration was because when he was mayor, he came out to Davis with us and met with farmers, and he was interested in that. And because he's connected, he has been connected to the wine industry, and he hosted the big Slow Food event and back in 2008. So I know he's deeply committed to this stuff. And this would be an interesting place to really measure, from my perspective, would be a real measure of his commitment. How deep does it go? Would it go that deep? So, you'll be hearing from us on that. So, a couple more questions. And this comes from, we did a podcast with Claire Fox, who leads the LA Food Policy Council. And in the course of that podcast, I asked her a question that she said, one of the toughest things that she realizes is that food and agriculture, everybody wants to talk about it. It's a sexy issue. But in the end, it's a low priority for a lot of legislators. In the end, they don't end up putting it as a priority. We've had that experience here running our small poultry producer protection act.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, we just didn't get the support we needed. And with other issues as well. So I'm wondering if you think that's a fair critique. And how do you think, as the food movement, we should deal with that challenge?
Yeah. So I think obviously one of the most important things is that we can't do it with just one piece of the food system. The food system has a huge collective voice if they would use it in a more unified kind of way. But that's really hard because we all come to this conversation about food from very different perspectives, and that usually it is more of a single interest of a piece of the food system, and yet it's a very complex and connected system. So how do we create more synergy around some really high priority issues where we could bring from the biggest brand name to the most ardent local vegan piece of whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? Because it is diverse. And at the end of the day, we're about providing good, healthy choices for every consumer. How do we use that to engage the imagination of our legislators about why it's important to pay attention to the very food that we grow and put on the tables and on the shelves in every corner of the state? How do we make that something that is more compelling, because it is the foundation, whether we're talking about homelessness or mental health or academic achievement, there is a food nutrition connection to that. Just the very healthcare dollars we spend. Why isn't food more center part? Which goes back to nutrition education. All the things that I'm so passionate about with our Farm to Fork and the work that we've been doing the last year now that we have taken over but we're now the coordinator of the California Farm to School Network. How do we make sure that we're actually sourcing more California grown, climate smart ag food products in our schools? How do we make sure that there's more education, nutrition, whether it's classroom or the cafeteria, that's capturing those young minds and having them being excited about starting their life with the best food and exercise habits possible? How do we provide more experiential, exciting opportunities to discover science and technology when it's applied to a garden or a culinary program? How do I get other people as excited about this and see the relevance of it to life that I obviously get excited about doing? I think there's opportunities to do that if we all continue doing this hard work of understanding each other's perspectives and finding those opportunities where we come together as one big food system voice. We're not going to be able to do it on all things, but let's work
not
on
in
that
a short
together.
period anyway.
And not in a short period.
Because so that raises a question for me about your perspective. So you've been in this position almost 10 years. Prior to that, how long were you at the
I was only
USDA
at
for 2 years?
For a year and a half.
Before that, you were at the grape growers for how long?
Almost 14 years.
Okay, so that gives you a lot of perspective on where things kind of began here around food system change. What is your perspective on how much progress has been made? How would you characterize that?
I think one piece of this, and it's because that's how the California Roundtable on Ag and the Environment, which you helped start, that actually started with an environmental organization, NRDC, and a couple of ag groups, and Rich Rominger is the former Deputy Secretary of USDA and CDFA Secretary, wanting to focus on one thing we thought we could do together, the conservation title of the Farm Bill. And over that time, we have built on the ground true partnerships around restoration and conservation with strong partnerships between environmental organizations and farmers. And so that kind of opened the door to maybe if we got out of our silos, we could do more of this kind of work. And I actually think a lot of the know your farmer, know your food stuff that the Obama administration focused on, when I came back to California, it was so exciting for me to see the great work that you were doing and Ag Innovations was doing to facilitate local food policy councils and local food alliances. And so Secretary Dooley, at that time Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I, we convened the
hosted
first
that big
statewide,
meeting,
because it was exciting work. And how do we stitch
that started
all
the California
together?
Food Policy Council,
It
that
did.
meeting that you guys
It
hosted,
did.
right?
So a lot of it has to happen locally because of the diversity of our populations in all of our different regions. But we just need to keep feeding that and facilitating those kinds of partnerships to really identify priorities that are as inclusive as they possibly can be.
So do you think, it sounds like you're saying that momentum has been building.
It continues to be. I don't want to discourage anyone, but if we focus on the small wins as well as the big wins, and if we focus on what's happening locally, because I see that across the state every time I have the chance to travel. We have a lot of good things that are happening that were not happening 10 years ago.
Right.
And we just have to make sure that we continue to allow that to flourish, that we show others what can happen if they're willing to work together and bring in all the different perspectives. I think we'll see some really great things happening over the next 3 or 4 years with the leadership we have from Governor Newsom and the first partner.
Yes, I know. I have been impressed by the first partner. She seems to be quite interested in school food, which is an exciting
Well,
thing.
think about they're a family with 4
Right.
young children.
Right.
And so they care because they're living that. That's part
And they're
of their
living in
everyday
Sacramento,
life.
and I met the assistant head of the school where they go the
great.
other day. Yeah. So, my sense there is kind of an ebb and flow to the momentum but I have a sense that right now, in the last several months, maybe the last year, I feel like agriculture, production agriculture, the more what you would call more mainstream agriculture, is more open than it's been in the past. I think to experimentation, perhaps because they're seeing the positive outcomes of many of the changes you've been describing. Healthy Soils is good. It's oversubscribed, right? SWEEP, oversubscribed. These programs are probably indicating that they don't have to be feared. They can
Right.
be allies.
Absolutely. So, it's like many things when change happens. There's usually, those few that become the early adopters or the champions, and then, bringing together their neighbors to see what they're doing, their willingness to share it just really helps us scale it up. And I feel that California's focus on climate is the platform. I tell everyone, ag is the nexus of everything, but climate is our platform because the work that we're doing, the fact that we're deeply engaged in it, and with the wildfires and the increasing temperatures and the loss of chill hours, agriculture is impacted first and most dramatically, but agriculture can also be part of that solution to all of this. We have different conversations than perhaps some of my colleagues in other states are having. But we live in a state, 40 million people, 80,000, well, maybe 100,000 actual farmers and farm workers that live in these rural communities, and the rest of the people are the voters. I think agriculture understands that we have to get out of our silos. And it can be uncomfortable, and especially when it seems like everyone's accusing us of things.
Right.
What we have to have is a real honest give and take kind of conversation to really understand each other's perspectives. And that's where I'd say California Roundtable on Ag and the Environment helped create some of that so we could build trust and relationships.
Do you think that it's time for a new, do you think there's space in everybody's schedule or for a new type of effort like that? Or do you think that stage of the development is past and we got to move to other things? Because that no longer operates.
Well, I think that part of it is because agendas get really full and who has time to do this and everything else they're doing. So I think it's always good to reevaluate everything and say, is it as relevant for the issues we're dealing with today? For example, 10 years ago, we weren't dealing with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Right.
That's going to have a huge and potentially very harsh impact in the heart of agricultural country. I mean, we've got agriculture everywhere, but in the valley, in the Central Valley. So that's creating new dynamics, but could create new opportunities. And there are the whole partnerships of the new groundwater sustainability agencies partnering with environmental organizations to understand if there's land that may not have water, what are the conservation habitat values of that land? What are the
And
other
how should it be compensated?
economic opportunities for this land for renewable energy? So we have different dynamics, and we just have to make sure that we can't just keep having the same conversation about X. We have to connect it to what's confronting the viability of agriculture today. And so climate, water, labor, but I really say climate, water, because that's what binds us all together as humanity.
And we also have the most control over those two things versus labor, which is really a national, federal policy issue. So it sounds like, I mean, the one way I would characterize it is that, 20 years ago when I got involved, 25 years ago, whenever I got involved in these issues, there was more of a defensiveness on the part of agriculture. I see that changing, and part of it may be the groups that are seeking change are less hostile because they realize the limits of hostility. Not all of them, but some of them. And also because it seems to me people are learning that there's more in common than probably separates them. Yeah. And maybe because of what you're saying, the opportunities are emerging. It's easier to see now, but it just seems to me that agriculture is more flexible than it was 20 years ago.
And then part of that's generational change.
Yes.
I think clearly generational change. There are
lots of great young leaders coming in.
Really great new young leaders. There are more women in leadership positions. Yes. I think that's a helpful thing. We need to continue to focus on the diversity of the voices of California agriculture that are speaking out, and we need to understand how building those kinds of political bridges can also make long-term sense for the real viability of agriculture. We cannot just. We have to have others who understand. It's that broadening the base of understanding of agriculture and what it takes for farmers and ranchers to continue to do what they're doing, that people have respect for that they respect that our large farms all started as small farms, but fortunately, if you are able to create a profit, the next generation wants to come back and farm with you, and then you have to either have more acres or vertically integrate or do something to support multiple families.
Right.
So we should be proud of our multi-generation families that have grown to be large entities because they're still supporting families and supporting local communities and do a lot on philanthropy to give back to their local communities. So I think we just have to keep broadening that base of understanding.
I think that's good, and I would agree with you. And actually, I have one last question for you. Okay. And that is, obviously, you, as you've described it, you have incredible enthusiasm for these issues, and I think a lot of hope for the future.
Absolutely.
And so, could you describe your top food, ag, and rural policy priorities for this year only? Like, what are you really going to focus on?
Well, I'm most excited about potential opportunities for California food for California kids, and really focused on when you think about 1 billion school meals, that's breakfast, lunch, snacks, after school, 1 billion meals a year served in our schools. I want it all to be sourced California grown, California climate smart agriculture. That's what we're seeking for our schools. But our school nutrition directors have a really hard job. So I really want to spend significant time on that because I think that's a win for our kids. Better nutrition usually leads to better academic performance. It's a win for the local economies because if we're buying more in our local economies, we're circulating dollars there. And it's a win for our farmers and ranchers of all sizes and scale. And then, of course, the continued work, as you know, one of my passions is conservation and stewardship on the land and what we know our farmers and ranchers can do as far as whether it's conserving the land, doing those stewardship practices, providing habitat, That's a big area for me. We've grown that portfolio. We'll continue to do it, and then really staying focused on the implementation of SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Yes.
That we are focused in supporting these local communities and building resilience. And that I've said from day one, we need to have a broader understanding of that rural economy. We have counties where ag is a driver of 50% of their GDP. At the statewide level, it's easy to say it's only 2%, but there are counties where it's much more significant than that. And I think the recent UC cooperative extension study that was released on the economic contribution of our working natural lands, which said $333 billion, is understanding that. And are we doing the things to bring the diversity of jobs and good jobs to our rural economies?
Okay. Those are worthy goals for the year, and we'll look forward to supporting those.
You have been listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast about food, farming, and the future. Flipping the Table is hosted by me, Michael Reed Dimmock, and produced by Patrick Sexton. Our production colleague is Doris Meyer. Our sponsors include Roots of Change and the Public Health Institute. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or would like to sponsor Flipping the Table, please email us at comments@fthetable.com. That's comments@fthetable.com. Thank you for listening.